3rd September 1939, the North Sea. Somewhere off the coast of Scotland, in waters the color of hammered tin, a Royal Navy destroyer cuts through a moderate swell at 22 knots. Her crew are closed up at action stations. The war is exactly 9 hours old. On the bridge, her commanding officer receives a signal from the Admiralty in London. It is not an order to engage the enemy fleet. It is not a directive to protect merchant shipping, nor to seek out the German surface raiders already rumored to be loose in the Atlantic. The signal contains 2 words that, to a layman, would seem almost absurdly modest given the circumstances. It reads simply, "Commence contraband." What began in that gray autumn of 1939 was not a battle in any conventional sense. There were no massed formations, no artillery duels, no dramatic moments of heroism that lend themselves easily to documentary film or popular history. What began was something far colder, far more methodical, and, as the evidence would eventually confirm, far more devastating to the German war machine than almost any single military operation of the entire conflict. It was the British naval blockade, and almost nobody talks about it. The mechanism was deceptively simple in concept, almost impossibly complex in execution. Britain and her allies would use their combined naval power to prevent any goods whatsoever from reaching Germany by sea. Not just weapons. 3rd September 1939, the North Sea. Somewhere off the coast of Scotland, in waters the color of hammered tin, a Royal Navy destroyer cuts through a moderate swell at 22 knots. Her crew are closed up at action stations. The war is exactly 9 hours old. On the bridge, her commanding officer receives a signal from the Admiralty in London. It is not an order to engage the enemy fleet. It is not a directive to protect merchant shipping, nor to seek out the German surface raiders already rumored to be loose in the Atlantic. The signal contains 2 words that, to a layman, would seem almost absurdly modest given the circumstances. It reads simply, "Commence contraband." What began in that gray autumn of 1939 was not a battle in any conventional sense. There were no massed formations, no artillery duels, no dramatic moments of heroism that lend themselves easily to documentary film or popular history. What began was something far colder, far more methodical, and, as the evidence would eventually confirm, far more devastating to the German war machine than almost any single military operation of the entire conflict. It was the British naval blockade, and almost nobody talks about it. The mechanism was deceptively simple in concept, almost impossibly complex in execution. Britain and her allies would use their combined naval power to prevent any goods whatsoever from reaching Germany by sea. Not just weapons and ammunition, everything: food, fuel, raw materials, industrial chemicals, rubber, copper, the copper wire that carries electricity through a factory, the Swedish iron ore that feeds the blast furnaces in the Ruhr. If it was heading toward Germany or German-occupied Europe, and it was traveling by sea, it would be stopped. To understand why this mattered so profoundly, you need to understand what Germany actually was in 1939. It was not, as wartime propaganda sometimes implied, a self-sufficient industrial fortress. It was in fact deeply dependent on imported raw materials. Before the war, Germany was importing roughly 80% of its iron ore, the absolute foundation of steel production, and therefore of every tank, every artillery piece, every naval vessel it intended to build. It was importing virtually all of its rubber, used in vehicle tires, gas masks, industrial seals, and hundreds of other military applications. It was importing approximately 65% of its oil. And crucially, fatally as it would prove, it was importing enormous quantities of foodstuffs that its domestic agriculture simply could not replace. The German High Command understood this vulnerability perfectly.
They had lived through the First World War blockade of 1914 to 1918, which, by conservative estimates, contributed to the deaths of somewhere between 400,000 and 800,000 German civilians through malnutrition and related disease. Hitler's entire strategic philosophy was built, in large part, around the desperate need to avoid a repeat of that experience. The seizure of the Ukraine, the invasion of the Soviet Union, the obsession with Romanian oil, all of it at its root was a response to the terror of the blockade. And yet, here Britain was, in September 1939, doing it again. The organization charged with executing the blockade was the Ministry of Economic Warfare, established on the first day of hostilities and headquartered at Berkeley Square House in London. This was not a glamorous posting. The men and women who staffed it were economists, statisticians, trade analysts, and lawyers, not the stuff of adventure stories. Their weapons were not depth charges or torpedoes. They were intelligence reports, shipping manifests, and something called the statutory list, which catalogued every company in the neutral world suspected of trading with Germany, making them subject to British interference. The physical enforcement of the blockade fell to the Northern Patrol, a collection of armed merchant cruisers and Royal Navy vessels that operated in the gap between Scotland and Iceland and Greenland. This was by any measure one of the most miserable postings in the entire Royal Navy. The weather in those latitudes is genuinely savage. Gales of force 10 and above are not uncommon even in summer. In winter, ships ice over, decks become death traps, and visibility drops to near zero for days at a time. The vessels themselves, many of them converted passenger liners pressed into service at the outbreak of war, were not built for this kind of work. They pitched and rolled in swells that left entire crews incapacitated with seasickness for weeks at a stretch. And yet they remained on station, month after month, year after year, intercepting neutral shipping and escorting it into British ports for inspection. Between 1939 and 1945, the Contraband Control Service boarded and inspected over 70,000 ships. Roughly 3,500 of those were seized outright, their cargoes confiscated. The remainder were either cleared or allowed to proceed under bond, a system by which neutral shipowners guaranteed that their cargo would not end up in German hands.
The technical sophistication involved in making this system work is almost entirely overlooked by popular history. The Ministry of Economic Warfare maintained what was, in effect, the most comprehensive commercial intelligence network the world had ever seen. Agents in Lisbon, Stockholm, Bern, Buenos Aires, and Istanbul tracked shipments, identified shell companies, mapped the networks through which German importers disguised the true destination of their purchases. A shipment of Swedish ball bearings destined, on paper, for a factory in Switzerland might actually be traced through painstaking analysis of railway manifests, banking records, and informant reports to a Messerschmitt plant in Bavaria. The ball bearing case is worth pausing on because it illustrates how precise and how consequential this work could be. Ball bearings are small, unassuming objects, the kind of thing you might find in a bicycle wheel or a household fan. They are also absolutely essential to almost every piece of moving industrial machinery ever built. Without ball bearings, factories stop, aircraft engines seize, tank turrets jam. Germany's primary domestic supplier was unable to meet wartime demand, making Swedish imports critical. Britain spent considerable diplomatic and financial capital attempting to choke that supply, buying up Swedish production before Germany could, bribing factory managers, and, occasionally, when other methods failed, having the relevant shipments disappear at sea under circumstances that were never formally explained. The Germans were not passive in response to any of this. The Kriegsmarine's U-boat campaign was, in considerable part, a direct counter-blockade,
an attempt to do to Britain what Britain was doing to Germany. And for a time, particularly in 1942 and early 1943, it came perilously close to succeeding. But there is an important asymmetry that often goes unremarked. Britain was a maritime trading nation, importing food and raw materials by necessity. Germany was a continental power that, in theory at least, had access to the resources of much of Europe overland. The fact that the blockade still hurt Germany as badly as it did, even after 1940, when German troops controlled the Atlantic coastline from Norway to the Spanish border, is a testament to how deeply integrated global trade had become by the mid-20th century, and how difficult it was to replace oceanic supply lines with continental alternatives. By 1941, German rubber stocks had fallen to roughly 20% of pre-war levels. Synthetic rubber production, accelerated in desperation, was consuming enormous quantities of coal and industrial capacity that Germany could ill afford to divert. The fuel situation was deteriorating steadily, forcing the Wehrmacht to take operational decisions, the drive for the Caucasus oil fields in 1942, most obviously, that were dictated by logistics rather than strategy. German agriculture, deprived of imported fertilizers and forced to release millions of farm workers for military service, was producing roughly 25% less food per capita by 1939 than it had in 1939. Rationing in Germany was severe from the very first months of the war, and it grew steadily worse thereafter. It is impossible to assign precise numbers to the blockade's overall contribution to Allied victory. The counterfactual is simply too complex. What can be said with confidence is this: every German offensive operation from 1942 onward was conducted against a backdrop of worsening material shortages that directly constrained what the Wehrmacht could attempt and for how long it could sustain the attempt. Stalingrad was not lost solely because of fuel shortages, but fuel shortages were a factor. The Ardennes offensive of December 1944 was not planned to succeed on the basis of captured Allied petrol stocks by accident. German planners genuinely depended on that fuel because their own was nearly exhausted. The blockade did not win the war, but it made the war winnable. The American contribution to the blockade effort, once the United States entered the war in December 1941, was significant, but built almost entirely on British foundations. The administrative machinery, the intelligence networks, the legal frameworks for intercepting neutral shipping, all of it had been constructed and refined over 2 years of British operation before American involvement began. This is rarely acknowledged in American popular history of the Second World War, which tends to emphasize the dramatic and the kinetic over the slow and the organizational. It should be acknowledged now. Today, almost nothing survives as a physical monument to the blockade. The ships of the Northern Patrol have long since been scrapped. The files of the Ministry of Economic Warfare are held at the National Archives at Kew, visited mainly by academic researchers and the occasional curious amateur. There are no museums dedicated to the Contraband Control Service, no memorials to the men who froze on the bridge wings of armed merchant cruisers in the Denmark Strait winter. Perhaps that is because the blockade does not lend itself to the aesthetics and heroism that popular history demands. There are no pivotal moments, no last stands, no individual acts of conspicuous courage that can be lifted out of the institutional context and made to carry the weight of the story. The blockade was above all a collective and cumulative achievement, the product of thousands of quiet, unglamorous decisions made over 6 years by people whose names are almost entirely forgotten. Return for a moment to that North Sea destroyer on the morning of September 3, 1939. Her commanding officer reads his 2-word signal. He looks out at the gray water ahead of him. Somewhere out there, a neutral freighter is making her way south through the Norwegian Sea, her hold full of goods destined, directly or indirectly, for Germany. He orders a new course. The signal lamp begins to flash. It does not look like the beginning of something that will help bring down the Third Reich. It looks like bureaucracy. It looks like administration. It looks, to be honest, rather dull. 6 years later, Germany lies in ruins. Its factories are silent. Its armies are surrendered. Its population is in many areas close to starvation. And the economists at Berkeley Square House quietly file their last reports, pack up their manifests and their shipping ledgers, and go home. The blockade worked. It just did not look like winning.